All right, what is up, my friends? Welcome to our next week of A Push Instruction. Here we are in week 9 of the school year. It's hard to believe we're already almost 10 weeks in and marching along closer to our AP test in May. First things first, I'm wearing my AP reading shirt. Oh, it's over here. My AP reading shirt from 2019, which I wore on purpose as a reminder to you to take a minute right now, pause the video, go to your AP Classroom portal login, and make sure you're enrolled in the class on the College Board side of things. See my email from Monday of this week. If you are confused or need the access code, it is all there. But if you don't enroll in AP Classroom, then you can't take the AP test and get credit for all your hard work that you're currently going through. So do that. Do that now. Pause it. Come back. All right, here we are. So this week's a little weird, obviously, because you only have 3 days of school. So my video today will discuss the era of good feelings and post-war nationalism. I'll then also post a little longer video on the market revolution or early industrialism in America and the creation of a more interconnected economy. So these two things really go hand in hand. But without a live session this week, it's really important that you put in the time and the mental effort on these two videos to make sure that you're on track and in good shape because College Board loves economic stuff, and this is right up that alley. So let's first talk about the era of good feelings and post-war nationalism. Now, obviously, in this case, if I'm talking about post-war nationalism, I'm discussing the War of 1812, which, as we talked about last week, the U.S. doesn't win or lose, and via the Treaty of Ghent, we established what's called status quo ante bellum, Latin for the way things were before the war. And that leaves us, though, in a place in which the nation experiences a huge upsurge in nationalism after fighting the war because of the Battle of New Orleans, which we talked about last week, and the way that ends. Leaves Americans with a really, really good taste in their mouth about the trajectory and the future of the country, which is going to carry us through culturally, politically, and economically into the late 18 teens. Right, the war ends in 1815. Today, we're really talking about like the next 5 years and this era of good feelings. So let's get going. This is the same picture that I showed you at the very tail end of class on whenever our live class was last week, depending on what cohort you're in. And let this image linger in your head as a reminder of what I'm referencing when I talk about the era of good feelings. Right? This growth in patriotism and pride in the United States. Here we have the 4th of July, obviously celebrating independence in 1819, so 4 years after the war. So there's this feeling of renewed, or maybe for the first time, new pride in the United States and the trajectory of the country and where it's going. Which at times was hard to gather before this point because so much of the country was unstable, whether it be from economic troubles under the Articles of Confederation or impressment troubles that could not be resolved because of the lack of credibility. So the era of good feelings really is this first time in which, culturally speaking, the Americans are proud to be Americans. Something that I miss. So these two presidential elections of the era of good feelings, they help us tell a story of what I mean when I say the era of good feelings. So if we look first, I'm going to move this over just a smidge for you for a minute. If we look first at the 1816 election, all right, so we've got to contextualize this. Right after the War of 1812, of course, the war ends in 1815, so 1 year later, Madison is served for his 2 terms. He, like Jefferson, like Washington, is stepping down after 2 terms. And just like Madison did to Jefferson, Madison's Secretary of State, James Monroe, is kind of seen as the next logical president to take over the country after Madison's presidency. So we talked about Madison's presidency last week, largely dominated by foreign policy problems and impressment, obviously culminating with the War of 1812. And we talked about the War of 1812 and the two really important things that come out of the war, both happen like when the war is technically already over. The first being the Battle of New Orleans, but the second being the Hartford Convention, which kind of really, for the last time, kills the Federalist Party's credibility nationwide. And then we see that reflected in these maps. I'm a big believer that presidential election maps tell a fascinating story in every election about what the country thinks about the most recent 4 years and the current and the near present future of what's coming next. So here in 1816, James Monroe runs against Federalist Rufus King. Rufus, good name for a dog. And what we see here is James Monroe wins pretty darn convincingly. Which tells us that the Federalist Party is most definitely losing even the little power they had that was kind of confined to the Northeast, to New England, as well as to some of the Atlantic seaboard states that have large urban populations. So here we have the Federalist Party that is dwindling in its control, its influence, its power, and a very popular James Monroe for the Democratic Republicans. Fast forward 4 years, and the Federalists are gone. We have James Monroe winning re-election by an electoral college, a really close call here, 231-1. John Quincy Adams, John Adams' son, who we'll talk about next week, he gets one electoral vote. Other than that, James Monroe wins basically unanimously. We see in this election there is no Federalist. We have the Democratic Republicans, and John Quincy Adams is identified as an independent Republican, so not part of the party, but same type of ideals. So this really shows what I meant when I told you last week that the Federalist, the end of their party, really in terms of being a national party, is the Hartford Convention. So what we see on these election maps, though, is unanimity, is the American populace being largely united behind the Democratic Republican Party, and that's for a couple of reasons. Reason one, the Federalists are gone, so that's one reason why we unite behind one party. But reason two is that without Federalist opposition, right? If you have two opposing sides that are fighting against each other, they tend to take opposite viewpoints. If you take away one of those opposing powers, then the other power kind of comes back to the middle to a more moderate stance, and that's what the Democratic Republicans are going to do. So we look at the era of good feelings as largely 1817 to 1825. Today we'll talk about the economic end as well as part of the political end of this era of good feelings, but it won't really be dead until next week, which we'll talk about the corrupt bargain of 1824, which is going to cause the fracture of the Democratic Republican Party into different groups. So what are some of the characteristics of this era? First, the death of the Federalist Party, right? Vitally important that the Federalists are gone, and because they're gone, the Democratic Republicans are able to adopt many of their ideas as their own because they don't need to be seen anymore as the counter or the opposite to the Federalist Party. So they take a more mainstream, moderate approach with some Federalist ideals, which is one of the reasons why Monroe's presidency is thus so popular. All right, so we see moderation to an extent, so a little bit of a middle ground on some things like banks, like national regulation of commerce and the like. Monroe wins the 1816 election as Americans are really nationalistic following the war, and he rides this nationalistic wave through his whole first term and into his re-election, which you just saw happen almost unanimously. And also really important to note in this era is foreign policy success. We talked last week about the lack of credibility that comes from not being able to stop impressment, not being able to stop, for example, like the XYZ affair and the ways other countries are disrespecting us. Post-war of 1812, the U.S. has a little bit more credibility on the foreign stage, and we see that reflected in the treaties that are signed and the way other nations are treating the United States. The Rush-Bagot Agreement or Treaty is signed in 1817. We'll talk about that in a little while. The Convention of 1818 is between the U.S. and Great Britain as well, which kind of settles the Oregon question about who has what land and where. And arguably the most important piece of this whole time period I talked about last week as well is the Adams-Onís Treaty. Spain looks at the world, looks at the U.S. the U.S. is getting a little more expansionist and realizes that Spain holding on to Florida is probably a bad idea. So they sell Florida to the U.S. for $5 million. But again, it demonstrates that the U.S. has a little more credibility and that Spain's willing to have that conversation rather than try to get down the road of like having to fight the U.S. over keeping Florida. So I want to talk about this in a couple different ways. We'll talk about political nationalism. We'll talk about foreign policy nationalism. And then tomorrow in your video, we'll talk about economic nationalism. So the Democratic Republicans, to this point, which you know from our first two-party system conversations, have represented the beliefs of limited government, right? Strict interpretation, strict construction, same thing. A weakened federal government with more rights reserved or saved for the state governments. That has been the position they have held since Since Washington's presidency, we think about Jefferson being anti-bank, anti-army, anti-response to the Whiskey Rebellion. It is the same ideology that then carries into Jefferson's presidency with his limiting of taxes and his cutting the size of the Army and the Navy and the size of the federal government, etc. We do see the Democratic Republicans straying a little bit from their ideals with things like the Louisiana Purchase and the Embargo Act. But for the most part, these are the values they've represented. But once the Federalists are gone as an opposition party, the Democratic Republicans are able to adopt many policies that were traditionally Federalist. Specifically, focusing on economic development from a national standpoint, looking at the whole economy like a national bank. Instead of a state-by-state economic situation, letting every state kind of do whatever they want economically. The establishment of a permanent army, which we see at the beginning of the War of 1812. The consequences of not having an established army ready to fight another country if we need to. The White House gets burned down. We see some Democratic Republicans embracing using the federal government to pay for transportation improvements like roads and bridges and canals. I'll refer to transportation improvements going forward as infrastructure. And even the creation of a national university in Washington, D.C., which was a Hamiltonian Federalist idea that gets put into place here, which reflects just, again, the moderation of the Democratic Republicans. And we see the best example of this, which I'll talk about again tomorrow, but I need to introduce today because it's a good example of the nationalism that I'm speaking on, in terms of Henry Clay's American system. Now, I told you about Henry Clay last week as a really important political leader in this new era. He's, of course, from Kentucky, from the West. And he proposes the idea of an American system, meaning a way to create a much more interconnected American economy in which all parts work together to create success moving forward for the nation's economy. Like Hamilton's financial plan, it's going to be quite similar. It's going to learn from Hamilton's financial plan. It's going to have three parts. Part one, create a new Bank of the U.S. Of course, the old Bank of the U.S. had expired under Madison's presidency, not Jefferson's presidency. I apologize for that. But the Jeffersonian Republicans have let the charter of the first bank in the United States expire in 1811, so that there is no national banking system to regulate the economy. Clay proposes renewing a new national bank to stabilize U.S. currency, so state banks aren't printing too much money. There's no regulation of money. He also is going to propose, like Hamilton, a new tariff, the tariff of 1816, to promote U.S. industry, right? If we're making it more expensive to buy foreign goods, we're encouraging people to buy American. And thus, this tariff would limit the importation of British manufactured goods and allow American industrial development to advance. And Clay is going to propose a much more interconnected national system of roads and canals to more interconnect the economy from region to region to region, right? And he thinks that since this is going to benefit the whole country, the national government should pay for this infrastructure, right? And ideally, this American system is going to unify the North, the South, and the West economically. And if you unify these regions economically, political unification will follow, and social unification will follow as well. Now, this is really the first significant protective tariff in U.S. history. And when I call it a protective tariff, that means it's meant specifically to protect American industry, to encourage people directly to buy their goods from America by making foreign goods more expensive. Thus, it's meant to encourage U.S. industrial growth. But all these ideas are, of course, proposed by Hamilton in the 1790s and then opposed at the time by Democratic Republicans. And now you have Henry Clay, a Democratic Republican, embracing these same ideals. Right? This American system is going to much more interconnect the nation and help pave the way, see, for roads. No pun intended. Didn't do that on purpose. Yes, I did. Help pave the way for future railroad construction, which will become kind of the next step in the 1850s and 60s of transportation advancements, as well as Indian removal to the west, which we'll talk about in about a week as well. So that's kind of our look at nationalism from a policy standpoint on that side of things. Our foreign policy nationalism is also very important. Right? It's important to note that in the era of good feelings, the policy that is pursued, foreign policy-wise, is nationalistic, meaning putting America first, but it also emphasizes the desire to maintain peace, to solve our problems diplomatically. Now that the U.S. has a little more credibility, let's use that credibility to solve our problems without having to go fight another war. And we do see that in the three uh, key events of foreign policy in the era of good feelings, as well as the Monroe Doctrine, which we'll talk about next. First is the Rush-Bagot Agreement of 1817. If you pay attention to my pointer, I will show you what I'm talking about. These are the Great Lakes. These are the Great Lakes. Very important. We talked about the Great Lakes as an element of British influence into the frontier before the War of 1812. Now, the Great Lakes are technically half British and half American. Today, they're half Canada and half United States. So in these lakes, though, the British Navy still has a significant influence. A lot of British naval ships and forts are here on the frontier in these lakes to protect their colony of Canada. And they're right to protect their colony of Canada. If you remember the War of 1812, the U.S. invaded Canada. So it's not like England's out of left field to protect their colony of Canada. But the Rush-Bagot Agreement, both sides agree, like, hey, let's just disarm the Great Lakes. I'll take my military out. We'll get rid of the forts and the ships and all that. You'll take your military out. Don't put any forts or ships. And we'll just call it, like, cool, right? You don't invade us. We're not going to invade you. We'll just be friends. We already fought 2 wars in the last 50 years. Like, let's not do that again. And it works, right? It works. It shows that the U.S. is respecting the British colony. The British are respecting the United States sovereignty, United States independence. And we just kind of disarm or take away arms, take away military presence from the Great Lakes. And it becomes a peaceful, non-militarized border, which is fascinating. 1 year later, the United States is over here dealing with the Oregon country, will later become the Oregon Territory. And the U.S. says, this is ours. England says, this is ours. Rather than fight a war about it, both countries just say, why don't we just share it for now? We'll just have a joint occupation. It can be kind of yours and kind of ours. And we'll just deal with it later, right? When it becomes more of a pressing matter, and we'll see what happens in the next few years. All right, so England's like, cool. U.S. is like, cool. All right, and then here we have again, what you see is the credibility of the United States buoying this this foreign policy of negotiation and not necessarily having to cause conflict because people respect you. Then, last, once we start making some agreements with England, that shows Spain that we're serious about spreading out. And Spain sells the United States the Florida territory in 1819 for $5 million. So across the board, though, this reflects this idea that the U.S. is pursuing a nationalist policy, an expansionist policy, but also a policy that's built on maintaining peace. Now, the most important piece of foreign policy nationalism that comes out of this era, of the era of good feelings, is the Monroe Doctrine. Now, James Monroe, as you know, was president. So this doctrine is, of course, named for him. And in the Monroe Doctrine, it is a statement to the world that says, Europe, if you create any new attempts to create new colonies, new empire, new imperialism in the Western Hemisphere, over here in North and South America, we will stop you. We will stop you because the Western Hemisphere is ours to maintain, ours to expand on, and we want to spread democracy here, to go back to like Jefferson's Empire of Liberty, which is of course misconstrued because it's mostly white supremacist liberty, but regardless, the U.S. is here to spread democracy to the Western Hemisphere. Don't be spreading your colonies, your imperialistic ideas. You see it pictured here as we see Uncle Sam maintaining control on the Western Hemisphere with the hat that says Monroe Doctrine, while all these European colonial officials are being stopped from coming over to create new colonies. Now, the immediate impact is quite small because the U.S. can't really enforce this because obviously still our Army and our Navy are quite weak, but it does represent this goal of the United States of maintaining control over their side of the world while trying to keep European influence out. So that's our foreign policy nationalism that is characterized via the era of good feelings. We also see some cultural nationalism. The United States starts expressing their own culture via art, via literature, via paintings, via music, etc. Our literature, this is going to be called the era of the American Renaissance. which means rebirth, which is hilarious because there's never been a birth in the first place. I don't know what the hell we're rebirthing. But art and literature, both in this era, are going to reflect nationalistic ideas, pride in the United States. James Fenimore Cooper publishes a very famous book that you may have heard of. There's a couple of movies that have been made out of it called Last of the Mohicans, which reflects the idea of the American frontier as a rough and tumble place where young men can go and tame the frontier and fight Native Americans. And it makes America unique. Again, a ton of white supremacist undertones, but not the point. Last of the Mohicans is this key early example of American nationalism expressed in text. Nathaniel Webster is going to publish the first American dictionary, which you might have sitting on a desk somewhere at home. Webster's Dictionary, it's still a thing today. But the American dictionary is going to separate a lot of terms from the way the English say things in Great Britain to the American version of those words. So it's the first time in which the American language is being expressed as different from England's English. It's hard to say. In art, we see a couple good examples. The Hudson River School of Painters is going to start publishing a lot of naturescapes, which are, I'll show you a couple examples in a minute, are examples of demonstrating the natural beauty of the U.S. in art as a way to express nationalism and pride, as well as a series of very famous painters and paintings that reflect the Revolutionary War in very reverent, revered ways. John Trumbull, of course, being the most famous example of these painters. Now, here's an example of Hudson River School naturescape, as you can see. All right, we see the light shining on America. This beautiful scene of untouched land with trees and rivers and lakes. Another example is this here, right, which shows that on the frontier, again, that the nation is a beautiful place and men are so small in comparison to the beauty that is the massive United States. Those are two examples of Hudson River School naturescapes. This very, very, very famous painting hangs in I believe, the Smithsonian, not the Smithsonian today, the National Archives, but I could be wrong. I often am. This painting, of course, reflects the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And it is painted by John Trumbull, who I just talked about, this guy, John Trumbull. A very famous painting that, again, reflects the exaltation of the Revolutionary War during this nationalistic period. So those are some of the characteristics of the era of good feelings. But good feelings often go bad, right? You have a good relationship, it's real nice the first 4 weeks, and you guys get tired of each other. Here Americans are getting tired of each other. So the era of good feelings is not all good. There are still three significant things that are causing tension. The first is the tariff. The South is becoming increasingly anti-tariff. I can tell you why. Tariffs make goods more expensive, right? If I have to buy an American good because the foreign good got a tax put on it, I'm going to pay more for the American good than I might have paid for the foreign good. Thus, I'm paying more money for industrialized goods. As you know, the South is largely an agricultural society, so they have to buy their industrialized goods from somewhere. Now they're paying more to buy their industrialized goods from the North than they might have done so from England. Again, the South also is worried about tariffs as an expansion of federal authority, with that little lingering fear in the back of their heads that if we let the federal government do blank, tariff, bank, regulate commerce, whatever, then they're going to come for our slaves next. Next, debates over the national bank, right? This new national bank in 1816. The South has become increasingly concerned with the expansion of federal authority. The national government's stretching their powers again. And again, the concern being that if we let the federal government have too much power, then where are they going to stop? They're going to come to take away our slaves. And third, debates specifically over slavery. The southern states specifically become increasingly agitated over their desire to spread slavery unrestricted to the rest of the western parts of the United States, which is going to cause some significant tension, which we'll talk about in a little bit, between the regions of the United States, because by now the northern states post-Revolutionary War have abolished slavery across the board. We know slavery is not in the Northwest Territory, et cetera, et cetera. So slavery is going to become increasingly a sectional issue, North versus South. Additionally, despite what we see in the election map, the Democratic Republicans are never really as united as it looks. There's the one faction that still believes in the Jeffersonian ideals of states' rights and limited government. And the other faction, like a Henry Clay, who's going to believe in kind of finding that moderate route. So we still see some infighting and debates between the two groups. And all of this is going to come really to a head. All of these little conflicts will all come to a head or come to into surface of our vision because of westward expansion. In the year 1810, before the war, 1/7 of the U.S. population lives in the broader West, right, the western half of the country, only 1/7. By 1840, over 1/3 of the country lives in the West. So there's a lot of westward expansion, a lot of expansion of territory and people to the western frontier, and that's going to then fuel some of these debates, and you'll see what I'm talking about here in just a second. All right, so Congress is going to quickly add 5 new states to the Union because of westward expansion and the population growth in these 5 states. Louisiana comes first in 1812, followed by Indiana up here in the old, this is important for later, Northwest Territory in 1816. Mississippi comes next, right there in 1817. Again, a southern state, so it's below the Ohio River via that old Northwest ordinances. Then Illinois, another north of the Ohio River state in 1818, followed by Alabama, a southern state in 1819. So you're kind of seeing north, south, north, south, north, south. But regardless, west, right? We're spreading out westward. Northerners are spreading out westward. Southerners are spreading out westward. There's a ton of westward expansion. And the 5 states that are added to the country back that up. Now, if I go back to the very beginning, let's go back to the very beginning. Here I am. Look at this. In 1816, this is what the election looks like. In 1820, look at all these new states. We got Missouri, that's new. We got Illinois, that's new. We got Alabama and Mississippi, that's new. So even in the election map, we see new states have been added because now they have their voice heard via the presidential election. So that matters a lot as well. Back to my map. So, South Louisiana, North Indiana, South Mississippi, North Illinois, South Alabama. So we're seeing westward expansion, and that's going to cause a couple of key issues. But we also see this via population density, right? In this 10-year window, the darker the green color here, the more people. We see that population density has spread out significantly in the next 10 years, largely along the Ohio River, both north and south of it, as well as here to like Kentucky, Tennessee, and some of the further south states. So this westward expansion is actually going to cause the end of the era of good feelings times 2. Right? It's going to actually cause 2 things, an economic cause and a social political cause that will cause tension. And they're both fueled by westward expansion. The first is the Panic of 1819. The Panic of 1819. I love teaching the financial panics in the United States history. So if you'd like to know more, shoot me a message. I'm sure you're fascinated by this just like I am. But the Panic of 1819 is really the first significant like depression or like downturn, or we call them now today recessions, in now that the U.S. is a more industrialized, advanced economy. The Panic of 1819 is the first example of a big downturn in the U.S. economy. It's caused by Western land speculation, meaning people are buying up all this Western land in the hopes that they can sell it to settlers for a huge profit. But that means that they're over-leveraging themselves or borrowing too much money to buy this Western land on the hopes they're going to get rich from it. And then when that doesn't pan out, people can't pay their loans back, and then next thing you know, the banks are struggling and it becomes a mess. So the first cause of the war is that Western expansion I was told you about. People are borrowing money to buy land they can't really afford to pay back, and things go a little south. It's also caused by inflation. Inflation, which during the War of 1812, there's always, not always, but there's almost always inflation due to war, meaning the government spending more money to supply the war effort, which pumps a bunch of money into the economy, and prices go up because there's a lot of money in the economy, but then once the war stops, there's no longer the demand for that type of production, so the economy often comes down to earth afterwards. And that's what happens here with the War of 1812. There's a lot of inflation in the war and then deflation after. Inflation means that money is worth more and things get more expensive. Deflation, of course, is the opposite, but that up and down cycle causes some economic chaos. And because of the deflation and the inflation that caused it, the Bank of the United States, the BUS, the Second Bank of the United States, they're going to pursue a tighter money policy, which means to print less money, to loan less money, to try to control this, and that kind of makes things a little bit worse for people. So people often blame the bank, even though it wasn't the bank's fault. It was Western land speculators' fault. Here we are. But the aftermath of this, the consequence of this, is first first recession of the market economy, the first shutdown of a more advanced economy. Second, northern manufacturers' solution to this problem is higher tariff to protect their industry. Southern farmers' response is lower tariff to protect their agricultural prices so that they could still buy goods without spending a lot of money. And Westerners are going to criticize land speculators like gamblers on land, land investors, another way to put it, and bankers for causing all of these things. So this really causes the first real turmoil over policy due to economic problems, which happens here. And we start seeing the crumbling of the era of good feelings because of economic reasons first. The second thing, though, is sectional problems. North versus South sectional problems. The era of good feelings is going to start with a wave of unity, a wave of national excitement. But soon we're going to see sectional disputes between the North and the South emerging that are going to dominate politics for the next 40 years. Right? From 1820 to 1860, almost everything we talk about is going to be dominated by sectional problems between the North and the South and the West to a smaller extent. Now, the North are going to disagree over the tariffs, especially when cotton prices fall in the 1820s after the Panic of 1819. The North and South are going to fight over slavery in the Western territories and Western states, and it's these sectional disputes that are going to be the other piece of what cracks the era of good feelings. And they'll come to a head via what ends up being known as the Missouri Compromise. So in 1817, if we go back here, in 1817, all these states we've added to the Union, we've added to the country, they all followed the precedent of the Northwest Ordinances, which is why I told you was so important under the Articles of Confederation. And what I mean by that is we determined if they'd be a slave state or a free state based on the Ohio River, which is right there in my red pointer. There's the Ohio River, right? So everything north of that technically fell under the Northwest Ordinances, and thus slavery couldn't exist. That implies that everything south of that does allow slavery to exist, and thus Kentucky's a slave state, Tennessee's a slave state, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, slave states, but Ohio's not, Indiana's not, Illinois is not, right? And we look up here, whenever Michigan decides to have enough people to become a state, well, then they probably won't have slavery either because they're north of the Ohio River. But in 1817, this brown area right here, where I'm highlighting currently, is Missouri. And Missouri applies to become a state. They have enough people. They want to, hey, let us into the party. We want to be a state. Missouri applies to be a state as a slave state, as a state with slavery. And this is what kind of blows up the sectional balance between slavery, not slavery, expanding that had been established via the Ohio River. The North is going to, at this point, like we talked about the Hartford Convention, very much resent or be angry about the fact that the southern states keep electing presidents. Why? Because they have extra electoral votes. Why? Because of the Three-Fifths Compromise, which then also gives them more votes in Congress. The fact that slavery ends up being a political benefit to representation is a problem. So the North is pissed. They don't want to let Missouri in as a slave state. The South is pissed. They worry, like they're always worried, that there's behind this is a northern conspiracy to end all slavery, to somehow come and abolish slaves across the board, right? And by up to this point, by alternating free slave, free slave, free slave, we've kept the balance, but Missouri threatens to upend that balance, right? Population's growing more rapidly in the North because of industrialization, which we'll talk about tomorrow, and urbanization, and of course the South's a more agrarian, spread out society, so they have less population. So the House of Representatives, which is based on population, ends up becoming more and more and more northern influenced. Whereas the Senate, because you get 2 votes per state, right, that's what the South's going to hold their control because there's no influence on population. So as long as they keep adding new slave states, they'll keep control and influence over the Senate for pro-slavery interests. And one solution is posed by New York Representative Roger Tallmadge. It's called the Tallmadge Amendment. He's obviously from New York, so northern. He argues that we'll let Missouri in as a current slave state, but only if they promise to gradually eliminate slavery in the next 20 or so years. Right? And that makes the South furious. How dare you tell us what to do with our slaves in the next 20 or so years, and so forth. See, we told you. We told you they're coming for our slaves. They're going to make us all abolish our slaves. So it demonstrates the sectional tension between the two sides over slavery. What ends up happening is a compromise that is created by Henry Clay. It is the first in a series of compromises that will give him the nickname the Great Compromiser. We'll talk about the rest of them as we go. But the compromise looks like this. They say, Missouri, here you are, right? It's the first state we've had to decide on. Here's Missouri. That's north of the Ohio River, and the Ohio River stops there anyway, so like you can't really use the Ohio River anymore as a dividing line because we've spread out west past that. Missouri, you, right there, you can be a slave state. You can be a state that has slavery. To keep things balanced, let's split Massachusetts into two, make a new state called Maine, and let Maine be a free state. So the North gets 2 senators, the South gets 2 senators, and both sides can just back down, take it easy, and relax. And to not have this fight again, because this fight was annoying, we don't want to have to keep fighting about this, we'll put a line. Just like we did with the Northwest Ordinances, so it wasn't a line, it was a river, but you get the idea. We'll put a line right there at the 36th degree 30, northern parallel, right there. Put a line. There it is, it's in red. Saying that for the rest of the United States, that we have at this time, at this point, for the whole rest of the United States, if it's north of this line, slavery is prohibited. Slavery is not allowed there at all. If it's south of this line, slavery will be allowed if the people that are in that state or in that territory desire it. So no slavery, yes slavery, and this line is going to be the dividing factor. So the North feels like they won to an extent because they got Maine and all this territory. The South feels like they won to an extent because they got Missouri as a slave state, which is kind of northern, and more territory, a little bit less, but territory here to spread out slavery if they so choose. And this, though, despite being a compromise that both sides walk away from, also demonstrates the end of the era of good feelings, like politically, socially, social-politically, because it demonstrates the real sectionalism that is dividing the country as well. So that does it for the era of good feelings. You should know the foreign policy nationalism, the artistic and cultural nationalism, the political nationalism that happens for a minute, right, as the Democratic Republicans adopt some moderate policies. And we'll talk next week and tomorrow about some of the other developments that help us understand why this era of good feelings does not last that long, nor is it that good. Have a great day.